This is Unevenly Distributed, a podcast from nexavize.com, where we talk to experts to find out what's next in digital technology and where it's real today.
This is Unevenly Distributed, a future tech podcast, and I'm Jeff Illimek. Today I'm joined by Mike Wood, a former colleague and manager of mine back about 10 years ago when he ran a chunk of the Avanade Accenture business in the US. Now Mike is a Google principal architect and the founder of strive.ai, which will be the focus of what we talk about today. Mike, welcome.
Great to see you again, Jeff. Excited about our session.
Great to connect again. I have been excited to get into this as well. As you know, I am into fitness and sports and competitive sports. I've been doing it for quite a while, as you have. I remember back in the Avanade days where you would be riding your bike to your road bike, your race bike, from Oak Park to the Loop in Chicago just to commute to the office on a daily basis, and then on the weekends go race triathlons.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mostly a runner. But I've been tracking data for running for probably decades now. I've got some of my old Garmin devices, like this big chunk of plastic that you had to strap to your arm to try to catch satellites back in the old days. A couple newer generations. I run every single day. I did a little bit of triathlon training, though, also. And I got a lot of use, and I continue to get use out of the data that I get from running. But when I did triathlon training and started to track and understand the data that I was getting off of the bike, I learned quite a bit about how important data is off of the bike, even at the level that I was at, which wasn't great, is why I'm back to just a runner. But the kind of data to even to understand the mechanics of what you're doing on a bike. So I've been fascinated by that, and I'm fascinated by what you're doing with strive.ai. So why don't you start there? Why don't you kick us off with the origin story of how you went from Avanade to Google to Strive, and then we can get into what Strive's doing today.
Yeah, so I guess it was 2016 or so that, so I was playing the role of CVP at Avanade, so I owned half the US business for Avanade, and it was great role. Really loved it. It was time for me to find a new role, and the roles that were being talked about for me were things like global service line lead or somebody to run outsourcing. And that just wasn't exciting to me because, I had moved to the Bay Area in 2013 as part of the running the West, right, for Aziz. And, when I moved to the Bay Area, it just gave me a lot more visibility into what's going on with tech. And I've always been a data person, right? I always believed that data was kind of the power in a company, and why companies would be successful is if they knew how to use their data properly. And think about what today's life is, right? That's all that it's about, right? In many senses. So, I was reluctant to go take another role. And, having been in the Bay Area for Avanade, Microsoft tech not really penetrated too well in the Bay Area. So I was forced with, hey, I'm going to go make this scary decision to retire from Avanade. And, I want to get a job with a Bay Area company that's tech, right? So, when I retired and I started to look for jobs, they're like, oh, you were a GM, a P&L guy for a Microsoft business. No, we don't have a role for that, right? So I literally had to go, I had to go back and retool, quite frankly, because, at the time, Avanade wasn't doing a ton of Azure. I'm sure today they do a ton. So I sort of picked on the cloud, and advanced analytics and data science is kind of where I wanted to repivot because the market trends were clear on that, right? So that's what I did. And, to get the job at Google, in many ways, strive.ai, which I worked on for about 18 months, solo, just as a learning activity. I put it in Amazon, did a bunch of work to understand Amazon, built all the stuff myself to kind of retool and get my tech skills back because it had been a few years since I've been really hands-on. So that turned out to be a really good strategy because when I got, one of your colleagues, Greg Molnar, referred me to Google. And that's where it's kind of a funny story, right? Because, having come from a P&L role, a GM role, I didn't really want to go do that again. I'd already done that, right? I want to do something with the customer, be relevant in front of the customers all the time, but still be in sales. And So that's why I went after what they call customer engineer role, which is what Greg was playing at the time. And that's like a solution specialist in Microsoft parlance, right? Somebody who's a tech salesperson, like somebody from the STU, if you think about a Microsoft org. And that turned out to be a really good role, right, for me. And so I joined. When I joined, I was given, because of Strive AI, I used it in my interview. I was given the lead CE role for Fitbit because Fitbit was one of our big customers in San Francisco at the time. So for 2 years, I worked with Fitbit. And then Google actually bought Fitbit. So that was quite interesting. And I since moved off that account and working on a few others. But, I think the cool thing is being a tech seller, being knowledgeable about technology and always in front of the customer is kind of where I think is the most fun. So that's why I selected that.
And I agree. And that's what I did my whole career. So I'm very sympathetic to that from that perspective. And in that, the kind of things that you have to think about, and what I'm sure what you thought about with Fitbit and what Strive AI does, taking that idea of data and, for you and I, a personal passion around sports and fitness and pretty competitive levels. I mean, you've raced quite a few triathlons and, it's relatively serious business. We can see the very nice bike hardware behind you.
Couple of my beauties. Yes.
The deeper that people like us get into these kinds of hobbies, the more we're bringing our tech skills and our enterprise data skills to that, and to our colleagues and competitors and people that we're working with. So you've got a bunch of users now of Strive. So why don't you talk a little bit about what Strive looks at, and then we'll break apart where we collect data and how data is starting to get used, not just in biking and running, but it's really getting used a lot in pro sports and that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's amazing. So, when I started Strive AI, it was really a learning experience. Like me, I'm obviously, like both of us, passionate about endurance sports. I like to consider myself a retired triathlete because when I moved to California and I started racing, where I could be top 10 and making nationals in Chicago, not in California. There's just a lot more talent here. So, I've kind of pivoted. I still ride a lot, but I do more mountain bike racing, gravel kind of races, more for fun, right?
Yeah.
And the real energy for me is like, okay, I'm always been curious about, some days you have good days, some days you don't have good days, right? And I never could figure out why that would happen, right? So the kind of the impetus of Strive AI was, well, maybe we should look at the data and see what is the data telling us about, like, why are some days I can do no wrong on the bike and I can, literally have the best bike split in the Chicago Triathlon. And then, other days I'm like flat and I can't perform, right? I'm still not able to answer that question today in spite of a lot of research, but, that is like the overarching thing. And I think a lot of people are using big data and a lot of the fitness devices that we have today to really hone in on that. Like if you look at the person who just won the Ironman World Championship, he and another Norwegian person, Christian Blumefeld, they have been transforming the sport of triathlon by really focusing on the tech and like, why do things happen? What is heat acclimation? How much acclimation do you really need? And how far can the body go, right, without destroying itself? And they said, basically the guy who won set like literally every record, right? And you can imagine he's beating people like Jan Frodeno, who we thought no one would ever beat that guy, right? But if you look into the data, there are things that they can tell you, right, of what's important. So that's kind of been the goal of it. It's not there yet. In fact, I'm kind of going to pivot the application quite a bit here in the next few months. But you can think of it as it's a Strava ecosystem app. Like Strava is a great social media platform, if you would, for endurance sports. So like when you go on runs or you go on rides or you go on swims, whatever, you can record them there. A lot of people record their skiing, whatever it is. People that like adventure use it, and it's grown quite a bit. I think when I started doing research to say, is this a good idea to do this, to learn, and maybe I could market it as something and use it as a business, I think they had maybe 30 million customers, and now I think they're up near 100 million, right? It's just been phenomenal growth. I don't think they've still figured out their, a complete business strategy on how to monetize that, but it's been very successful. And one of the things I like about them is they encourage people to build these companion apps, right? So it's pretty obvious how it works. You authenticate against Strava and you say, yeah, I grant Strive AI access to, and you can decide, do I want Strive AI to see all my stuff or only things that I make public and not private? Do I want them to see my profile or just my activities? And so that was where it started. And then we added Garmin Connect, because what I found with Strava, they don't give me a ton of access to the data because they really can't, right? They are getting the data from people like Garmin themselves, right?
Right.
So,
right. They don't do the device, they do the app or run off the phone. And potentially what the phone gives them, they can get more of that over time, which is getting better. But when you've got a device like this, or even an Apple Watch strapped to your wrist, and you can get more things like heart rate and ECG, and on top of the both the inertial data around movement and then just the GPS data, you can get a ton more.
Yeah, particularly with Garmin, like for example, Strava gives me access to heart rate and power and things like that if they're present. And they give access to like 7 streams of data, like maybe temperature, elevation, speed, power, heart rate, things like that. But I couldn't get access to other things, like what are all the sensors that are being used right now? What are their identities and what model are they? And, all these kind of extra more detailed things that are in the Garmin Fit files. And then the other thing, the really big pivot for me, why I selected Garmin for that second integration, is anybody who's building new innovative sensors, and there's a bunch of them on the market now and more coming, a lot of them are building on top of that Fit file standard. So they'll embed their data, like muscle oxygen is a good example, core body temperature is a good example. There's even some people working on things like drag coefficient, like real time telling you what your drag coefficient is on your bike by placing sensors, on you and on the bike, to basically give you kind of a low cost wind tunnel. That stuff, it's all being innovated now. And I find that they're more likely to be in the Garmin feed than they are ever going to be in Strava. So if somebody's trying to get at the real data, you kind of need that extra boost.
Right.
Also did the relationship with Training Peaks, which Training Peaks, the reason why I mention it is there's a lot of science to endurance sports.
Right.
And Training Peaks has been some of the innovators over the years in terms of like, okay, what are the metrics that people like to track? Right. So that's why I partner with them, and they basically licensed their terminology to me.
Which is interesting. So that's the place where I've gotten tripped up on this a little bit, just in my personal use of this kind of data, is what are the things that I should be tracking and what questions should I ask of the data? So I've got all of the movement data, I've got all of the elevation data, I've got some heart rate data, and I've tried to do heart rate, CO2 max, blood ox. I've tried to do some of those kinds of things over time when I was running. Well, when I was doing marathons, especially when I was down in the 3-hour range, sub 3-hour marathons, I was very focused on that, because I was very focused on both in the speed work on a track and how was I pushing my times lower and lower and lower. And as you get more competitive, as your fitness level gets to higher and higher thresholds, you need to do orders of magnitude more work in very specific ways to get even those smaller and smaller gains. But I could never make good use of things like heart rate and blood oxygen content, because I kind of didn't know the right questions to ask. So between Training Peaks and Strive AI, it sounds like the direction that where I would get help would be, hey, here's some information, here's some insights. So tell me about, and it's even more on the bike. I barely scratched the surface on the bike. The idea of conversion of body energy into power on the bike, and all of the sensors and all of the technique that you can sort of impart to make that happen. I've I know even less about that.
I mean, I think, some of it is like some people just know, like, like if you go to Leadville, Colorado, and you're going to race the Leadville 100, you know that you're going to be operating at 10,000 feet and you're going to struggle because you're not used to that, right? So some of those are sort of basically, I would say, common sense. But, somebody who's new to the sport and has never done anything like that doesn't have any knowledge or background in that, it might be nice to just say, well, what kind of impact is that? Like for most people, how big of an effect is being at 10,000 feet elevation, right? What does it do to your heart rate? What does it do to your power? And so those are the kind of questions that we're hoping to be able to quantify, if you would, right? Like in one case, a super trained, very good athlete that lives at altitude, it's probably negligible impact. But somebody who lives in Florida, it's going to be a bigger impact, right?
Right.
They may have a better chance of dealing with the heat, right? But dealing with altitude is different, right? So those are examples of the questions that we would like to answer that are probably easier to answer and probably would be less controversial. And then, the deeper you get into like, okay, well, some examples of things that I'm curious about is what exactly does drive my resting heart rate to go lower, right? And what kind of things tend to make it go up, right? And how predictive is resting heart rate for things like my running pace or my ability to generate power for an hour, right? You sort of have to say, what is your goal? And then try to take all the variables and data you have and try to figure out, okay, which ones are more predictive of that than others, right? And then that alone even tells you something like, should I be focused on my resting heart rate? Should I be focused on my VO2 max? Should I be focused on my stride length as a runner or my ground contact time? All these things are potential variables. Our hope at strive.ai is to start to put some context into that. Okay, yeah, this is really what's leading to what, right?
That makes a ton of sense. I've done some coaching of amateur runners in the past, and I've worked with coaches, running coaches. Jim Spivey, who's a former Olympic miler, he lives over here in the Midwest, and I've run in his running group on and off over the years.
Oh boy.
Having a coach where you can ask them, and they've got sometimes it's just inherent knowledge based on their experience, and maybe it's not necessarily even codified. Getting that codified would be useful, but having a digital coach that can watch all of your body metrics and your data and maybe expand into even beyond these sensors. Something like I was reading a kinematics, human kinetics journal, and they were talking about cameras, which is something we're using AI on a lot right now, visual cognition type of camera AI, watching gait analysis. As soon as a runner, and I imagine this is simpler in biking, but it's very prevalent in running. As soon as a runner gets tired, your gait, your form can start to break down, and that's when you'll get injured. So there's a thing in training where coaches will tell you, listen to your body. Don't overdo it because you don't want to get injured and then take yourself out of your racing season. That's worse than stepping back and taking some time off. But it's hard. It's hard to quote unquote listen to your body,
especially in a race, right? You're and you hear the commentators talk about it. Like if you watch the Ironman, and I think the last Ironman was quite good because it was the first time they were back in Kona, doing, and I think since 2019. So it was just good to see all that, camaraderie back, and commentators were brutal. They're like, oh, look at their gait has changed. And I'm like, come on, man, you're not doing the race. Stop talking about their gait. But it's true. Like, you can tell when somebody all of a sudden has gone too deep and they're a little bit impacted. I hadn't really considered the video stuff, but I see that every day at Google, like video intelligence at Google is like breathing, right? They do that a lot. And I think for like, even in Chicago, when I would, I don't know if you ever heard of them, I think they're called Blue Dolphins or something like that, but they're a swimming coaching system, and they would videotape your technique, because things like running and swimming, the technique is majorly important to how effective you are, right?
Yes. Well, especially in swimming. And this is why swimming is the main reason I stepped away from triathlons. I'm a good runner. I'm a mediocre biker. I'm a terrible swimmer. And I could have done the work for many years to work on technique, and swimming it's like 90% technique. Running, I think biking is a lot of technique. I mean, you have to learn the mechanics and how to transfer power. And running's somewhat instinctual. Humans run. I mean, you say get away from me, and you will run away. You have to have good technique to stay injured and stay healthy and get the most out of it. But I was such a terrible swimmer and a mediocre biker. I said, well, I could do really well in running races, or I could do really mediocre as a triathlete. I'm going to go back to running.
Yeah, I miss Chicago running. That was when running was fun. Like here, it's just like either straight uphill or straight downhill. And the downhill is what kills me. It's just really hard on the hips and knees. So it's been a challenge. But, the good thing about going into the office at Google is like right there on the Embarcadero, I can run and it's flat, right? It reminds me of Chicago.
Yeah. So there's the data sets that we're getting off of these kinds of devices, the Garmin, the computers on the bikes, new devices and new sensors that are being applied, sensor packages, external sensors. What about the data and you started to mention this, a key case, even just straight up elevation, but there's also weather and temperature and wind speed. And are you pulling in, or where do you see even just broader those external data sets being mashed up with internal data sets? Because that's a core of big data is great.
Yeah,
let's grab all the data that we can.
Yeah, if you're trying to understand what's happening, you need to look as much data as you can, and weather is definitely critical. And we've been pulling in weather data for a while. I'm having to go through a bit of a change on that right now because Apple bought the vendor we use, Dark Sky, which has an API that we found pretty good. In most places, it had like strive.ai is kind of a global platform, so there's athletes all over the world, and some parts of the world it wasn't really good at, but most of the US is very good. Most of Canada, most of England and everything was very good. Places like Australia, not as good. But one additional data point or a couple different data points we want to start collecting is like the air quality, because we think that living in California, it's kind of it hasn't been a problem necessarily for the last few years, but before that, right, it was a regular recurring problem. And I know it's big all along the West Coast. And I think it's happening in Spain and other places too, where the air quality is definitely impacting aerobic fitness and activity. And, being able to correlate, well, okay, what kind of impact is that going to have? And maybe if you're going to have a race where you might be dealing with some poor air quality, like what do I need to plan for if I'm not living in that context? How do I deal with that? So we already pull in like wind speed, wind direction, humidity, things like that, which all have a pretty material impact on your performance. I think what we've done with it has not been great because a lot of it's really tied up around like, okay, how do you get your best PR on a Strava segment? Waiting for the tailwind to happen. It's a neat feature, but it's a bit too nuanced, right? So we're thinking maybe like peel back a little bit and say, how is weather impacting some of your the things that we get from training peaks, or like your peak heart rate for 5 minutes, your peak heart rate for 20 minutes, your peak power for similar time ranges, and then maybe your pace over certain distances, like 1 mile pace, 800 meter pace. That's probably more useful to somebody trying to understand what is the impact of humidity or temperature or air quality. So we're a bit too wrapped around like trying to be like Strava, and it's like maybe we need to be more wrapped around like this ability to ask questions and get interesting answers. It's kind of a pivot we're hoping.
Which is where the core ideas behind data science come from, which is now that we've got all these data pieces, we've got them all sort of spread out in front of us. Let's spread out all of the cards, and now let's ask new questions. Let's dream up the new questions. We've got all of the answers here. They're buried somewhere in these data feeds. Let's figure out the questions, and the questions are the hard part.
Yeah, exactly. So, what we've done for the last month is incorporating more data from Garmin. Like we used to just get the activity files. which had some stuff in there. Like it would tell you, for example, resting heart rate in the activity files, what your resting heart rate has been over the last 7 days as an average. And what we just recently did is we get that from the health API. So it tells us every day how much sleep, what's their heart rate, how many steps did they take, how much elevation have they gained, all these things, which is a little more like giving you more actual feedback instead of a rolling average, right? It's more like, so you can tell, like yesterday I went on a really hard bike ride, as I often do on Thursday nights, and I noticed my resting heart rate was up like 3-4 points this morning. And it's because, it was a very hard workout. So my body's like, oh, dude, what did you do? I need to relax, right?
Well, that's interesting. So for that, and because it can potentially start looking at you and what things affect you, you could have that digital coach aspect then be able to come in and say, hey, I saw what you did. I saw what you did this afternoon. You're going to need to do this kind of thing tomorrow. You're going to need to cut in half what you thought you were going to do tomorrow so that you can get optimal performance in the long run.
Exactly.
Having someone there, and this is another sort of coaching technique, having someone there to tell you when to back off and to rest and to recover was almost more important for the very competitive athletes than having someone there to push you, because they would push themselves too far and break things.
Yeah, just think how successful Whoop has been. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they made like a boutique branded Fitbit for endurance athletes. So they couple kind of a hardware with a pretty bespoke user experience that is all about, are you ready for your next workout, right? Do you need to rest, or are you ready? And it's been very successful. I think, it's the type of thing. They have another thing in there that I really like is like lifestyle attribution. So that's one thing we're considering adding is like your ability to, like a classic example that happens to me is if I go out on my gravel bike and I do a race that should probably be done on a mountain bike, but I do it on a gravel bike, then I'm like, my neck is sore or my back is sore. I'd like to be able to attribute that. It's like, do I have neck pain today? Yes or no, right? It's just a binary on or off. And then you can start to see like, well, what choices am I making that are leading to that? Maybe that's in the data. Like every time I go play ice hockey, that's what happens to me. Or every time I ride my gravel bike, or I shouldn't, is a little example. And they do that for a bunch of lifestyle things. Like you're taking certain medicines, how are you drinking alcohol, or, these kind of things. Right. And I think that's where a lot of this is going. I see Fitbit trying to do stuff like that too. So it's pretty interesting, like very kind of coarse grain, high level, like lifestyle attribution that you can start to draw some conclusions on. Things that are not like exercise supported by data, but it's like something else, right?
And all competitive athletes know this intrinsically as well, and work quite a bit on diet and sleep and things like alcohol consumption when it's good and potentially useful, and when it's not. I've cut back a lot of that myself just through experimentation. I feel a lot better, and I can get better workouts when I don't drink. Okay, well, that doesn't take a lot of data science on that one to feel it out. But things like sleep recovery, how much, diet can get much more complicated. Diet in general, and diet specifically around the race. When are you using things like calorie supplements before, during, and after? When are you using protein recovery supplements after? And how soon and how late and how many grams? There's a whole bunch of data that can probably be gathered around that to help with that lifestyle element as well.
Yeah. There's a guy I know at Google that is actually working on an app where you can just, instead of like all the complicated, like typing in everything that you ate, he's like, I just built a computer vision application that would look at your meal and basically enter all that data for you. And I was like, wow, that's super useful.
Right.
I imagine that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen. You'll, either scan like if you're eating something that you have bought at the store, you can scan the label and it'll dissect all that information for you, or just literally take a picture of your plate, like many people already do on their social media.
Right. And
that area is a lot of complexity, so we probably aren't going to go there initially. But the thing you think about with endurance sports is like there's so many factors that are involved, right? We're probably looking at a fraction of the things that can influence, right? Diet
right.
is definitely one of them. You just have to pick your battles and go, what are people going to tolerate? How much data input are they going to be willing to share, do,
And sustain over time when
and
it's
sustain
something
it.
like that where you have to do extra work to gather the data set versus having a bike computer that just collects things passively
Yeah.
for you and just uploads it automatically. Like I went into Garmin Connect even in just before we started talking today, and Garmin Connect and my phone and my watch, all the data's up there. And I used to have to, upload it or make sure it got up
Yeah.
there. Now it's just there. And I can just look at it all. I can look at it and track it over time. That makes it work for me. If I had to like type in I have
Uh,
spreadsheets, but if I had to type in a lot of
that's
extra
what we
things,
used to do is
it'd
have
fall off.
spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got my spreadsheet, but nowadays so I've got my spreadsheet going back to 2014 when I used to enter it all by hand. In the last few years now, if I want it still in the spreadsheet, I just go to Garmin Connect and export it. I export
Yeah.
it at years at a time at this point.
One thing that triggered me, you talking about the diet and stuff, like I found this fascinating over the last year or so. There's been a lot of discussion at the pro tour level about what kind of devices you are allowed to use. And one of them is like a blood glucose monitor where they were like, no, that's an unfair advantage for you to know what your current status is as a professional cyclist in a race, whether you should or shouldn't
Really?
eat. And they said that's too much knowledge, right? So I was like, what? Like, you don't want people to be at their best? I don't understand,
Yeah,
It,
that
it, it
is
will probably
interesting.
change because there's a
Yeah.
lot of devices now where you literally just snap this little thing on your arm and it can tell you real time what your blood glucose is,
And
which obviously is super important for cycling.
that's been a holy grail of what Apple's been trying to get into their watch from an insulin monitoring perspective,
Yeah.
for diabetics. And once it becomes pretty widely available, it's not. I would imagine if it's widely available and everybody has access to it, then that's something that would make it
Yeah.
easier for them to accept it. It's not like a performance enhancing drug in any way. It's food. It's the things that
Right.
we're
So
all eating. So that I would be surprised that they're sort of
yeah, I
locking
mean,
that
they
in.
have all kinds of rules of when you can and when you can't eat. So it's not terribly surprising, but I thought, I bet somebody revisits this, right? Because, ultimately you want the best performance.
Yeah.
You let people use aero bars, right? You let people use all kinds of tech to be faster, but, you're not going to let them do that. I don't know. It
Right.
just seems a little weird.
So there's all of the data about me and all of my sensors and putting that together and getting insight from that. There's the third-party data sets that we're pulling in. One of the
Mhm.
things that we look a lot at when we're looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence is comparing me to peers or broader data sets and getting insight across people like me and then being able to
Yeah.
predict things or do comparative analysis or create an AI model that can watch and learn from many people and then extrapolate from that back to me. Where have you seen that go, and what are your thoughts as far as where that's at with the AI side?
It's a great point. Like when we first built Strive AI, we basically focused only on like basically you're looking at your data and your data is not really being, used to compare you to other people initially. I think what we're thinking now is it's actually very useful to compare you to other people to see, how many cohorts are there for things like we talked about your susceptibility to heat, core body temperature, humidity, altitude. Are you like everybody else or are you different? Right. And I think those are some of the underlying questions we want to initially answer is basically looking at a cross section, right? We call it like population studies. And that's really what true statistics and true machine learning really is you're looking at all the data, not just
Yeah.
data for you, right? So where we have done one feature where we look at, we call it the strength and weakness finder using, I don't know if you've ever heard of the company Stride, but they make a foot pod for
Yep.
runners. And it sort of manufactures a power profile, so you can run with power, right? So they have this whole methodology which has been proven to be very successful, doing a negative split, in a marathon or half marathon, or running at a pretty steady, consistent power, can yield much better results, right? So what we did is we ingest their metrics, right? Because they're also in the Garmin feed, and we can basically compare people. Like, let's say you and I both run 7-minute pace on average for a 10K. We're looking to see what's different about us, right? Is our gait about the same? Is our ground contact time about the same? What things could you do differently that might lead to a better pace, right? Comparing you to other people like you. So, we look at all the data there, form a regression, basically fit a model that says this is what everybody's data says, and then here's where you're a little bit different, right? Here's where, each metric you're kind of either a strength or a weakness, or you're about the same, right?
Yeah.
And it's been reasonably successful. I think we want to do that more, especially the idea of cohorting, find out, what are other athletes like you, right? That we haven't explored it a ton yet, but I think that's definitely on the horizon. Is having more of a true big data. You're looking at everyone's data at the same time, as opposed to just fitting a model for one person.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you expect as you get into collection of more data and analytics on the data that the adjacent industries might be interested in that data, like the bike manufacturers and running shoe makers and sports fitness wear makers? Do you think that that's going to be an outcome of this at some point?
I mean, it's a super aspirational thought. I think you got to start with the table stakes, though. Like, if people are going to contribute their data to Strive AI, and they are going to do so in a way where they participate in, let's say we'll use the word experiment, right? And I think we could have a follow-up on what an experiment is. But, what I see working in the Bay Area for all the tech companies is they're always doing experiments, right? A/B testing, trying to see what is successful. We'd like to do the same thing, but you have to do it in a way that is clear to the user that they know. Like, so if I'm going to participate as a user in something that's, breaking people into cohorts for VO2 max, like what is impacting your VO2 max? What's making it higher? What's making it lower? They need to say, yeah, I agree that I'm going to participate in that study. And they want to know how's the data going to be used. So in that context, we would never, share the data with anyone else, right? You would be anonymously participating in it, and you would do that. So that's kind of the first level. And then, above that, right, we think there are a lot of people that make sensors that would want to have a digital relationship with their user base, and they probably don't have the wherewithal. Like, what I find is you got people who are very good at making electronic sensors. Like, Garmin's a great example of this, right? They're very good at making electronic sensors, and they manufacture some of the neatest variables, like mountain bike dynamics is one of my favorites, right? I can see how much airtime I've had on a jump and all this stuff. It's very fun. But they're not very good at the user experience and how to actually make that data worth something, right? So, I think brands that are creating sensors might want to have that digital relationship, right? One of my buddies in Chicago is a senior executive at SRAM, and I've often thought I should call him, and because why wouldn't SRAM want to have your chain is about to break, right? You probably need to buy a new chain, or, have you noticed that your power has dropped by this much due to this, and I think the more sensors and everything that are on these bikes, particularly like e-bikes, I think it's a foregone conclusion they're going to want to have a digital relationship with their customer base. So we've got that kind of as a horizon idea.
Yeah.
But
I really like that idea. I like the idea of someone that's really good at the analytics and the customer experience and being able to work with many, many data sets and pulling it together, sitting in that intermediary position. Because what I also don't want, which I see quite a bit, not just in sports fitness devices, but any device that's got some data set, is that device now wants to own a relationship with me. And so now I've
Yeah.
got an app and a relationship and a newsletter that I get from my tea kettle. And now I've got one for my stove and my
Yeah.
watch and my shoe and my my headband. And
Yeah.
I don't want 50 apps, one for each individual sensor device, because that's not optimal
Yeah.
either. So I think that would be a good place. I also love this idea of the experiments, and we should probably follow up at that at some point. I like thinking about even opting into experiments. Say, Nike comes to you and says, "We want to try some things, and we want to sign people up non-anonymous and ask them to do some things, and open it
Yeah.
up, and maybe we'll compensate them in some interesting way. You'll get a free pair of shoes out of it." But you gotta do these runs or tweak your runs in this way, and we'll customize based on the data to you. And that,
Yeah.
I think that would be potentially really interesting to be able to give them access and open it up in some big ways.
Right. Kind of the gateway way we're thinking of this is, Strava has this neat thing called a Strava Club. And so you see a lot of clubs, and, some of them are brands that have a club, and they'll do challenges to try to motivate you to buy some of their merch. But then there's other clubs that are just like a local bike shop, right? Or a group of people, like there's a group of people that have this event in Oakland every year. It's called the East Bay Dirt Classic. And they set up like a challenge and a contest. And a lot of people are doing that now, and they're building their own little bespoke app to do it. I'm like, we could probably do that at scale, and have like, if any Strava club could have a challenge that they want to do. I think Strava's leaving some stuff on the table with, I don't know if you've ever heard of Zwift, right? But Zwift is the
Yeah.
super successful app, right? Just way more successful than Strava, I think, in monetization terms. And, they did it by making a virtual world that you could compete with each other, right? So they have races and they have rides. But what about like a cool bike shop like this? This bike shop is in the Marin area, and it sells really high end bikes, and they have great rides. But if they had like challenges that you could do where you could win an AC challenge, right, and we could support that with our app, right? I think that would kind of be a pretty good breakthrough, right? Because not everything has to be a race where you're lining up at the same time, like with
Right.
things like Strava. You could do a virtual window of 2 weeks. Who's the strongest athlete on this course over the last 2 weeks? You could do it every month, right? And it would be very
Right.
easy. There's probably a lot of legal stuff, right? You have to work through, like, who's paying the insurance of something like this and all that. But,
Interesting.
it's another one of these aspirational ideas.
All right. So as we sort of get to the end of this segment where we're thinking about the data and we're thinking about the sensors, there's a couple things that come to mind. We already talked a little bit about AI and machine learning. I think that's going to be a big thing for the future. But if we're looking 3, 4, 5 years out, there's a couple other things. The advances of sensors in just the phone that we carry on us, I think that's going to be a big chunk. 5G. So we already did a session on 5G. We did a talk with one of the 5G leads. Being able to have live access to potentially much more complex models of data and insights live, like while I'm out on a 6-hour bike ride.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on 5G and just live high bandwidth access for all of your sensors and datas and everything going on all over the place?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a foregone conclusion to me. Like, what I see every day is people doing what we call streaming ingest, where you're have a constant stream of data coming across, right? A data pipeline, and you're doing real time inferences based on that data. Like we've seen many examples at Google. Just something simple like, I want to know every time my logo shows up on an NFL football game feed, right? Then there's somebody who has to count that by hand. Why wouldn't we just use video intelligence to do that, right? For endurance sports, I think it's just a matter of time before the bandwidth, in the Wi-Fi out in the world, like 5G, is so densely meshed that you can do that and have real time analytics for your, either a race or a workout. Whether or not the governing bodies will let it be legal, I think people are going to build that, right? I mean, for sure, it's going to happen. Whether it'll be, the way I look at it is there's always some disruptive group that comes in, and, you have people like Garmin who build devices that are very good, but do they have the ability to build, running machine learning models locally on them? I don't know. Like Apple and others, Google, they do have devices where they're building bespoke system on a chip setups where you could do a lot of real-time stuff. I think it's going to happen. Yeah, it's probably still a few years away, but Formula One, I'm sure it's already happening, right?
Right. Right. We
sure.
know it is there. I really like that idea. And, one of the things that we can do with 5G, especially because you've got the edge computing going on at the mech towers themselves, you can run big models there. But when you've got a complicated device like a bike computer, being able to push models out on demand when it's needed, even if we can't use it in a race, using it in the workout and being able to adjust what I'm doing when I'm out on a ride and have that digital coach that either speaks in my ear in an earpiece or in a heads-up display on AR glasses and says, hey, just so you know, this is where you're at. This is what we're noticing right now. You should either step it up or crank it back or take a break and have something to eat. That seems to me to be a place where whether or not we only get like 0.01% of gain out of it, we as athletes are going to want to do it and take advantage of it. Because I think that's a piece of it as well.
You've probably heard the term marginal gains, right? There's several pundits that are really fun to watch, right? People like these guys from Silka, where, just how you do your chain, do you use wax or dry lube and all this stuff, where they're talking about, 7 to 10 watts. That's what people are looking for, right? Because the level of competition is so great, right? That the marginal gains are important, right? So I think the heads-up display, real-time analytics, while you're doing stuff, clearly is going to be at least a marginal gain, if not more.
Right.
I say it's a no-brainer.
All right, Mike. Well, this is been a really fun talk. It's really fun because it's also very personal. It's something that I'm involved in. And now I want this so that I can have that kind of heads-up display, even just for entertainment purposes while I'm running, to have that coach telling me what I'm doing in my ear. I would like to stay connected because as you said, I think there's what we can talk about in terms of the next step, which we're doing predictive, even the thing which I didn't expect, predictive maintenance on a bike, as the bike is a machine, and having predictive maintenance and predictive analytics on the machine itself is really interesting. So we'll save that for a future talk. But I do really appreciate jumping on, and it's been great to talk with you again. I already did my run for today, but now I want to do, and I'm going to go run really long tomorrow.
Go take that cool Scott bike. Is that a Scott Attic or what is that behind you?
It is a Scott. It's a Scott Carbon.
I'm guessing it's a Scott Addict. It's a very nice bike. They're some of the most popular bikes now. If you get a chance, go look at this guy, Safa Brian. He's a YouTuber that rides Scott bikes, and he goes to some crazy places and does some crazy downhill stuff.
I need to do that, beautiful. And I need to follow up with you. I didn't even know there was a difference between off-road bikes, between gravel and mountain bikes. So I'm going to have to follow up with you on that, because that getting into more trail riding is something I'd like to do around here. Just casually off. Not as a workout or a race, but when I'm not running and just want something fun to do. So
fantastic. It's been great to reconnect, Jeff, and let's definitely do another one.
Excellent. Sounds good. Well, I will talk to you soon.
All right, buddy.
This has been a Nexavize production. For video, links, and to support the show, please visit nexavize.com. That's NEXAVISE.com.